Thanks so much, Christian. As Christian said, we have a really good panel here, so I'll try to keep this relatively short, but I want to at least put out some fodder, I think, for the discussion. So what I'll be talking about is, as Christian said, some observations, results from some work we've been doing over the past 12, 18 months, the World Bank, also with the European Commission. So can I have this? Yeah, I have the slides. So let me start with just a picture. Probably a lot of you have seen something like this before. This goes a little bit to those two numbers that Christian put out before. We all know that the production of the economy is not smooth across places. We have peaks and valleys, and this is kind of a view, this is actually a slightly old one, but of what the EU looks like. And I think this is natural, and in some ways it's necessary to have this unevenness, but it also has consequences. And it has consequences not only for the regions, but for the people who live in those regions and their opportunities. And it has, why are the slides going forward? Sorry. And it has implications also for social cohesion. So, I think when we look, although that slide is no longer there, when we look at that, I think the issue is that we don't expect to see the Netherlands, right? We don't expect to see flat across evenness everywhere, but we also don't expect to see massive peaks and valleys. We probably want something like Umbria, right? Some rolling hills where we have some small peaks of opportunity. So for some reason the slides are moving without me pressing them. Yeah, which is a bit problematic. I don't know if anyone, but so anyway, back to, so let's just talk a little bit about the current trends of convergence in the EU. We've actually, going up to the period before the crisis, we had a period of relatively strong convergence across, certainly across countries, but also across regions. And once we hit the crisis, we kind of lost a little bit of steam of that. In fact, since then, we've seen divergence happening across regions at the regional level. This chart here just shows you the cohesion policy category. So you have your more developed regions, your transition, and your less developed, and how they kind of, between 2005 and 15, how regions fared that were in those. And what you see is basically more downward than upward mobility, which tells us there's been polarization. And it also says that for a lot of regions, particularly some of those regions in the middle, those transition ones, they've been kind of falling back a bit. Now, this kind of divergence that we're seeing at the regional level, particularly again since the crisis, is, we talk about NUTS 2 level regions. If you go down to an even more localized level, we're seeing a similar trend towards divergence. And we're seeing it at the household level as well. So some work that Christian has led recently really highlights this quite significant household level inequality that is happening throughout the region. So when we talk about lagging regions, we're referring, so if you look at that map over on your right there, it's, in the European Commission context and in cohesion policy context, we're talking about some specific regions. So we're not talking necessarily just about the less developed regions, but there's a specific program which targets types of lagging regions, right? And we can talk about what we call low income, which is essentially regions that are relatively poor, and low growth regions. So it's kind of the east and the south. When we talk about lagging, we generally think about slow growth. And what we can see in this diagram, which shows you a little bit about how rich regions are and how much they've grown on average over the past decade, is we have quite different types of regions. So even amongst those low income regions to the east, we have had quite strong growth and convergence in Polish and Romanian, most Polish and Romanian regions, but less so in the, say, Hungarian and the Bulgarian regions. They've been converging, but at a much slower pace. Then we have the lagging regions of the south, where you can see kind of off to your right there, Italy, Spain, Portugal. And then we have the Greek situation, which everybody here knows well, where obviously, because of the crisis, we've had very, very low growth. We've had decline, but we've also, we're seeing basically features of both low growth and low income, because the levels of income in most of these regions now are on par with what we see in the low income. So we kind of, talk about three types of regions we need to worry about, in a sense. We have the low growth, which is pretty obvious. We have these low income regions, they seem to be converging rapidly, but that's not going to continue forever. And they vary a lot. Some of them have the conditions to continue to grow, to continue to see productivity growth, and others are going to hit the wall relatively soon and will become the low growth regions of the future. And then we also have these old, kind of what we call the old industrial regions. These are a lot of these transition regions that before the crisis were beginning to transform their economies and were kind of knocked back. And that's kind of a concern for the future. So these are the kind of three types of regions that we talk about. Now, it may be easy to say, look, it's, all this divergence that we're seeing is a function of the crisis. And in fact, we do see some evidence to say that since, in the past year or two, we're seeing a little bit of a kind of convergence reappearing. We believe that it's not simply a cyclical issue, that there are structural factors that are pushing towards divergence. And one of the most important ones is technological change and globalization. And what this chart is showing you is that basically across all of Europe, across all regions, across all countries, no matter which part of Europe you talk about, what we're seeing is a decline of manual jobs and an increase in jobs that require higher knowledge, cognitive type jobs. This trend is pushing hard and it will continue. And what it means is we're going to see continued polarization in the labor market. But it also has spatial consequences in the sense that skilled people are concentrated generally not only across countries but within certain parts of countries. So the regions that are lagging, that often have lower skill bases, are going to likely face stronger trends towards divergence going forward. So when we think about policy then, okay, what can we do about it? So the rest of what I'll say, we'll talk a little bit more looking forward. And I think as just a kind of general concept, what we are coming to when we look towards the future of cohesion policy is something that is pretty simple and perhaps a bit banal in the sense that what we're saying is, convergence is an objective of cohesion policy, but absolute convergence across regions in terms of their economic outcomes is not a realistic target. And the emphasis should be more on maximizing the potential of regions and working directly with regions to improve potential. And when we think about convergence, when we think about equality, we should be thinking not about equality of economic outcomes per se, but equality of the opportunity for individuals and the equality of opportunity for firms to benefit from economic opportunities wherever they are. So whether they're in their region or whether it requires moving to another place. So that's kind of the concept. And one implication that has is essentially what it's talking about for regional policy, for cohesion policy, is really centering policy on the regions themselves. And that means not only tailoring policy and tailoring strategies to the needs of individual regions, but it also means making sure that regional programs, for example, are truly regional and not simply national programs that regions have to fit into. So I want to just show you this map. So I won't go into any of the kind of economics, but this is just a kind of a model that says what are the factors that determine GDP per capita, and it says how do regions, what are the region's current potential based on that. And so as you can look there, the kind of green and the darker green is the regions that have the highest potential, and the red are the ones that have the lowest potential based on their current endowments. And that's, shouldn't be surprising. It kind of maps to what we see already in terms of the levels of GDP per capita. It doesn't completely match, by the way, and even if you look within Greece, you see some regions that are actually performing better than you'd think they would perform. Based on the endowments that they have. And other regions, and I can say, for example, Central Macedonia is one that comes up, where they should be, the GDP performance should actually be better than it is based on the endowments that it has. So we see variation there. But the point is, this potential can be raised, and it can be raised during a cohesion policy program cycle and over the medium term. And there's kind of three different areas that we focus on to exploit. One is human capital endowments, and we include education and institutions in that. This is really the critical ingredients over the medium term. Second is the locational endowments, so the market access you have, which relates to infrastructure, but also the density and how you take advantage of agglomeration opportunities. And then the third area is more in your kind of sectoral policy, what we call smart sectoral policy, and we're specifically kind of referring here to this smart specialization approach. And that's, again, going back to this issue of making sure that we're linked to specifically what the regions, their comparative advantages. So the overall policy message there is that if we look at the way cohesion policy is being implemented today, we're calling a bit for a little bit of a rebalancing in the sense that we want to make sure that the sectoral interventions are very well tailored, but also that they're complemented by addressing the distortions that exist in some of these markets. And a real effort to build the endowments. And without doing it in parallel, in a complementary way, we're not likely to see the kind of growth take off and the opportunity to exploit potential that we'd like. So what I'm going to do is, just to finalize, is just very quickly step through 5 areas of policy that we think are high priorities in this. And for the first one, is about agricultural transformation. And just to make I'm going to ask my colleague Rogier to say a bit on this, but just to make us, as a starting point, we all know that, development happens through structural transformation, and that usually happens through moving out of agriculture and into other high value added activities. But there's a lot that needs to be done within agriculture and to complement it in order to achieve that. And maybe Rogier can just mention a few words on that.
Yes, thanks, Tom. So when you think about lagging regions, the first culprit that comes to mind is always agriculture, no? So is there something wrong in agriculture? Are they not moving fast enough out of agriculture and into manufacturing? Because we know that if it's done well, then whereas agriculture doesn't necessarily produce economic growth at a national level, it reduces poverty. So all the successful nations in the world, from my own country, Holland, to China, to Japan, to Korea, you see this process of structural transformation starting in agriculture. Basically, it means that small farmers have some money in their pockets. They can invest it in their farm. They can invest it in some non-agriculture business. They can invest it in the health and education of their children, so that if they grow up, they can choose not to farm, but do something else. So we looked then at agriculture and poverty in the European Union. Like I said, successful transformation, the role of agriculture is to reduce poverty. If it's done well, poverty should be gone. We got data in collaboration with DG Regio, poverty maps of the NUTS 3 areas. So we know at quite a detailed level what the poverty in all these areas are. Then we got from DG Agri, we got the Common Agriculture Policy data. Remember, a huge program, 40 million transactions a year. Yeah? It reaches virtually every nook and cranny of the EU. So the farmers have something at their disposal that they could use to move into higher productivity so that they can afford the health and education of their children. What did we find? First, we found in the EU as a whole, there is no correlation between agriculture and poverty. It's a random plot. It means that in some countries, agriculture is related to poverty, in others it is not. Look at this graph. Ideally, so if you look at the right upper hand quadrant, in those countries, and I've indicated Greece there, agriculture and poverty still go hand in hand. So in areas, in NUTS 3 areas where there's a large agricultural share of the total landed area, there's also a lot of poverty. But in the left lower quadrant, the correlation is gone, it becomes negative. Actually, the more agriculture you have in those areas, the less poverty there is. Those are the countries which have successfully moved away from agriculture. Yes, people move out of agriculture, but those who stay behind increase their productivity, have higher incomes, and reduce poverty. So Greece is in an incomplete phase yet. It should be moving from the upper right to the lower left. Now, what does it take to get there? We had a session this morning, or earlier, about comparing agriculture in Israel, Holland, and Greece. The story is quite simple. To get agriculture profitable, very basic conditions have to be in place. Property rights, rural roads, connectivity, farmer organizations, especially if you have a lot of small farmers, they need to organize, health and education. And we see that Greece, on a number of these basic conditions, doesn't score very well. There's no farm advisory system in place at the moment, for instance. You have a lot of small farmers, but there are no co-ops that are really working. You know, things that in Israel and Holland have done very, very well. Second of all, the use of the cap. So we found that the cap as a whole indeed reaches poor areas, but then what it does depends a bit on how the countries use the cap. For those who are not aware of what the cap is, there are two major components to it. One focuses on what's called coupled payments. These are payments that ask farmers to produce certain crops. The others are decoupled or just related to investments. The farmer is not told to produce a certain crop. He can use this money as he wishes. We find that those first type of payments, the coupled payments, had no relationship to the increase of agriculture productivity or the reduction of poverty. We could find no correlation with anything, actually. But the decoupled ones, the ones that are not distorting in a sense, that it doesn't tell farmers what to do, they had a positive effect on agricultural labor productivity and on poverty. You should ask yourself, in Greece, are we using the cap between these two types of payments, are we using them well? We can have more questions about it, but that's the basic point. You want to go from the upper right to the lower left, but there are some basic conditions and a good use of the cap that you have to achieve.
All right, thanks, Rogier. I'm going to kind of very quickly go through the last four. So the second point is about the business environment, the regional business environment and the national business environment. In the low growth lagging regions, and Greece is no exception, we see a large number, dominance of micro-enterprises in the economy, mainly focused on non-tradables. It's also true that in lagging regions versus non-lagging regions within these low-growth countries, the countries with low growth, we see more micro-enterprises in the lagging regions. Now, one of the main reasons for the dominance of micro-enterprises is the business environment. The graph you see on the bottom quite clearly shows that there's a strong association with the kind of what the World Bank's doing business indicators as a measure of the business environment and the size of firms, right? So if we're looking to attract investment in firms and looking for firms to grow to the size that they can create jobs, addressing the business environment and the regulatory factors are absolutely critical. So we can work on improving the capacity of the SMEs themselves, but if they're operating in an environment that kind of holds them back, then this needs to be a priority area. Third is urbanization. I think we all know that cities are critical for economic growth and for productivity. In most of Europe, including the low income and the low growth lagging countries, the largest metropolitan areas have been performing quite well. But secondary cities, the levels of productivity in secondary cities are lagging quite significantly behind. This is just a picture of Romania. And I won't go into the details, but one of the key things that we found in looking at this was, and we see this the same in just about all parts of also of Southern Europe, is that we see a hollowing out actually of the cities, especially a lot of the secondary cities. So, and this relates to planning inefficiencies, but it also relates to issues like housing and education, and it basically means that we have a big suburbanization trend. Which is affecting the effectiveness of the cities to actually generate economic wealth. So urbanization is a third area. And then the last two, first, education. This is easy to say, but it's difficult to deliver, but it's absolutely essential. And we're not talking only about vocational education here. We're also talking about foundational skills. So if we go back to the beginning and talk about this demand for more cognitive skills at work, we're talking about improving the quality of education at the foundational level. And now this graph, I think, is really telling. So this is the spread of PISA scores. So the scores, and we look at the bars, which are the reading scores for Italy, which are the black bars, different regions of Italy, and then some comparisons. And this tells you two things. So Italy varies from, its top region is achieving at the same level as Finland, which is, I think, the European leader. And its lowest region is worse than Bulgaria's average, right? So we have this massive spread. The difference between Calabria and Veneto is equivalent to 2 years of schooling by the age, this is at the age of 15, I believe, right? So 2 years of schooling gap. So when you have this kind of gaps in the quality of the education across regions, you cannot expect the opportunities for people and for the regions themselves to converge without addressing this. So then finally is the issue of institutions, and this we kind of call, the elephant. I think, everybody knows institutional quality. Whenever you run it in an economic model, it matters for everything. But what it is and what you do about it isn't always so easy. What we can say is that in all of the lagging regions, just about all the lagging regions, low income or low growth, institutional quality on the measures, the European quality measures, are below average. But it can change over time, and even what we see circled here are Greek regions, and you actually see a split. Some have improved over the 3-year period here, some have declined. And I think just as a final point, the message of this is that institutional quality is not only important for helping firms to function effectively and helping individuals to operate efficiently, but it's also important to actually deliver cohesion policy. So to kind of develop the strategies and to implement the strategies of cohesion policy requires strong institutions in the regions. And what that means is actually building capacity. And so as a final point, I would say that when we look forward to cohesion policy, the initiatives that have started in the last programming period to really put a lot more emphasis on capacity building at the local level, we believe needs to really be pushed forward in the next round. So I will stop.